The iron gates of Thornfield Estate stretched endlessly into the foggy Connecticut evening, their imposing presence making Grace Patterson's stomach churn with nervous anticipation. She clutched her worn leather purse tighter against her chest, feeling the crumpled bus ticket and her last $20 bill through the thin fabric. The mansion loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel. All sharp angles, towering spires, and windows that seemed to watch her every move. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the wind that whipped through the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. Her second-hand interview dress, a navy blue number she'd found at the Salvation Army, felt suddenly inadequate against the grandeur that surrounded her. The hem had been hastily taken up with safety pins hidden beneath the fabric, and she prayed they wouldn't come undone during what could be the most important meeting of her life. Grace had traveled 3 hours by bus from her cramped studio apartment in Hartford, using the last of her savings for the fare. The classified ad in the newspaper had been her last hope. Housekeeper wanted for private estate, live-in position, excellent compensation, discretion required. The word discretion had made her pause, but desperation had won over caution. Her landlord's eviction notice was due in 5 days, and her bank account showed a balance that wouldn't even buy her dinner. The massive front door was carved from what looked like a single piece of mahogany, with brass knockers shaped like lions' heads that gleamed despite the overcast sky. Grace raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, catching her reflection in the polished brass. Her auburn hair, which she'd spent an hour trying to tame into a professional bun, was already coming loose from the humidity. Freckles dotted her pale cheeks, and her green eyes betrayed the exhaustion of someone who'd been working 3 part-time jobs just to keep a roof over her head. Before she could second-guess herself further, the door swung open with surprising silence. "Miss Patterson, I presume?" The woman standing before her was tall, austere, and dressed entirely in black. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features, and her pale blue eyes assessed Grace with the efficiency of a computer scanner. "I am Mrs. Hartwell, the estate manager. You're precisely on time. Mr. Blackstone appreciates punctuality." Blackstone. The name sent an involuntary shiver down Grace's spine. She'd tried researching her potential employer online, but had found surprisingly little information about the reclusive billionaire who owned this sprawling estate. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for this opportunity," Grace replied, following Mrs. Hartwell into a foyer that could have housed her entire apartment. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, supported by marble columns that gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Grace would earn in a lifetime. Their footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor as Mrs. Hartwell led her through a maze of corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and landscapes that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. The mansion felt alive, breathing with secrets and whispered conversations from decades past. "The position requires complete confidentiality," Mrs. Hartwell said without looking back. "Mr. Blackstone values his privacy above all else. The staff quarters are comfortable, and meals are provided. Your duties will include maintaining the private wing of the estate, organizing Mr. Blackstone's personal belongings, and ensuring his comfort during his irregular schedule." Grace nodded, though something in the woman's tone made her skin prickle with unease. Irregular schedule. Mr. Blackstone is particular about his routines. He often works through the night and sleeps during the day. You'll rarely see him, which is precisely how he prefers it. Mrs. Hartwell stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of a particularly dark hallway. "This is the private wing. Under no circumstances are you to enter the study at the end of this corridor without explicit permission. Is that understood?" The warning sent another chill through Grace's body, but she nodded again. She couldn't afford to ask questions when this job represented her only chance at financial stability. "Mrs. Hartwell opened the door, revealing a surprisingly cozy living area with warm lighting and comfortable furniture that contrasted sharply with the Gothic grandeur of the rest of the house. "These will be your quarters. Settle in tonight and begin your duties tomorrow at 6 a.m. sharp. I'll leave your initial instructions on the kitchen counter." After Mrs. Hartwell disappeared back into the shadows of the corridor, Grace finally allowed herself to breathe. The room was more luxurious than any place she'd ever lived. A queen-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, a fireplace with logs already arranged for lighting, and a window that looked out over manicured gardens that seemed to stretch for miles. She unpacked her few belongings into the mahogany dresser, hanging her 3 other outfits in a closet that could have stored 20 times as much. As she prepared for bed, Grace caught herself staring at the forbidden door at the end of the hallway through her window. A thin line of light glowed beneath it, and she could swear she heard the faint sound of classical music drifting through the walls. Curiosity killed the cat, she reminded herself, but the phrase only made her more intrigued. 3 days into her new position, Grace had settled into a routine that felt almost too good to be true. Her duties were surprisingly light: dusting antique furniture, organizing books in the library, and preparing simple meals that were left outside the mysterious study door. She never saw Mr. Blackstone, but evidence of his presence was everywhere. Coffee cups that appeared and disappeared, sheets of music scattered across the piano bench, and the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the study during the late hours of the night. It was on the 4th night, while she was organizing the linen closet near the forbidden study, that Grace's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The classical music had stopped abruptly, replaced by voices, one she recognized as belonging to a man with a deep, cultured accent, and another that made her blood run cold with its menacing tone. "You can't keep hiding forever, Jonathan," the sinister voice hissed through the door. "The families are getting suspicious. 3 years is a long time to be dead." Grace's hand froze on the doorknob of the linen closet. "Dead? I am dead," came the reply in that refined voice she'd been hearing through the walls. "Jonathan Blackstone died in that car accident, and everyone attended his funeral. The man you're looking for doesn't exist anymore. Cut the philosophical bullshit. You know why I'm here. The Romano family wants their money, and they don't care if you've been playing dead or living on the moon. $50 million doesn't just disappear." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she was certain both men could hear it through the door. She pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. "That money was payment for services I never received," the cultured voice replied, and Grace could hear the controlled anger beneath its calm surface. "If Vincent Romano has a problem with that, he can take it up with my lawyers." A harsh laugh echoed through the door. "Your lawyers think you're dead, remember? Makes it a bit difficult to collect on legal fees." The sound of a chair scraping against the floor made Grace realize she needed to get away from the door immediately. But as she turned to flee, her elbow knocked against a crystal vase on the hallway table. The sound of shattering glass seemed to echo through the entire wing like a gunshot. The voices in the study stopped instantly. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she heard footsteps approaching the door from the other side. In that moment of pure terror, she realized that her desperate need for employment had landed her in the middle of something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The door handle began to turn with agonizing slowness, and Grace knew that in seconds she would come face to face with a man who was supposed to be dead, and whoever was threatening him. Her hands shaking uncontrollably, Grace stared at the broken crystals scattered across the marble floor like diamonds, each shard reflecting the light from the study as the door continued to open. Everything she thought she knew about her mysterious employer was about to change forever. And deep down, in a part of her heart she didn't want to acknowledge, Grace realized she was more terrified of what she might feel when she finally saw his face than she was of the danger that surrounded him. The door swung open, and Jonathan Blackstone stepped into the hallway, very much alive and more devastatingly handsome than any dead man had a right to be. Jonathan Blackstone stood in the doorway like a man caught between two worlds, the one where he was supposed to be 6 feet under, and the one where a terrified housekeeper had just discovered his most dangerous secret. His dark hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. But it was his eyes that caught Grace's breath, steel gray and filled with a mixture of resignation and something that looked almost like relief. "Well," he said quietly, his cultured voice carrying a hint of dark humor, "I suppose introductions are in order." Behind him, Grace could see a shadowy figure moving in the study, the owner of that menacing voice that had made her blood run cold. The man stepped into the light, revealing a face that belonged in a crime movie, scarred, weathered, and wearing a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little problem, Johnny," the man said, his Brooklyn accent thick with threat. "Your help seems to have very good hearing." Grace's legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She pressed her back against the wall, the broken crystal crunching under her feet as she tried to make herself as small as possible. "Grace." Jonathan's voice was surprisingly gentle when he spoke her name. "I need you to go to your room now. Lock the door and don't come out until morning. Can you do that for me?" The stranger laughed harshly. "Oh no, sweetheart. You've heard too much to just walk away. We need to have ourselves a little chat." "She has nothing to do with this, Vince," Jonathan said, stepping protectively between Grace and the other man. "She's been here less than a week." "Vince Romano?" Grace whispered, recognizing the name from the conversation she'd overheard. Her voice came out as barely a squeak. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Grace, please, go to your room." But Vincent Romano's predatory smile widened. "Smart girl. Yeah, that's right, honey. Vincent Romano. And your boss here owes my family a considerable sum of money. 50 million, to be exact." Grace felt the world tilt around her. $50 million. The number was so astronomical it didn't even seem real. She'd been worried about making rent, and these men were discussing amounts that could buy entire neighborhoods. "I told you before, Vince," Jonathan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That contract was void the moment your people failed to deliver what they promised. You want to take this up with lawyers? Fine, but leave her out of it." "See, that's where you're wrong, Johnny boy." Vincent pulled out a cigarette and lit it, completely ignoring the no-smoking signs that were posted throughout the mansion. "The thing about faking your own death is that it makes traditional legal channels a bit complicated. So we're going to have to handle this the old-fashioned way." Grace watched this exchange like a spectator at a tennis match, her head turning back and forth between the two men. Jonathan's protective stance and the way he kept glancing back at her with concern made something warm and unfamiliar flutter in her chest, despite the terror of the situation. "What do you want, Vince?" Jonathan asked wearily. "Simple. The money plus interest. Call it 60 million now, considering the inconvenience of having to track down a dead man." Vincent took a long drag of his cigarette. "You've got 72 hours. And if I refuse?" Vincent's eyes slid to Grace, and his smile became positively reptilian. "Well, let's just say your pretty little housekeeper here might find herself in some very unpleasant circumstances." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonathan's entire body went rigid, and Grace saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "You touch her," Jonathan said, his voice so low and dangerous that Grace barely recognized it. "And dead or alive, I will destroy everything you've ever cared about." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the air crackling with tension. Finally, Vincent stubbed out his cigarette on the marble floor, leaving a black mark on the pristine surface. 72 hours, Johnny. Don't make me come looking for you again." He brushed past Jonathan and Grace as if they were furniture, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Grace and Jonathan stood frozen in the aftermath, the only sound their own ragged breathing. Grace realized she was shaking, whether from fear, adrenaline, or the after-effects of being in such close proximity to the most intriguing man she'd ever met. She couldn't tell. "Are you hurt?" Jonathan asked, turning to face her fully for the first time. Up close, he was even more striking than she'd imagined during those nights when she'd wondered about the mysterious man behind the study door. His features were sharp and aristocratic, but there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. I'm okay," Grace managed, though her voice shook. "Are you really dead?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jonathan let out a laugh that held no humor whatsoever. "That's complicated," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I suppose you deserve an explanation. Come on." He gestured toward the study that had been forbidden to her since her arrival. Grace hesitated for only a moment before following him into what had been the most mysterious room in the mansion. The study was nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of the cold, intimidating space she'd imagined, it was warm and lived in. Books were stacked everywhere. Sheet music covered the grand piano in the corner, and a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where someone had been hiding from the world. "Please sit," Jonathan said, gesturing to a leather chair near the fire. He moved to a bar cart and poured himself a generous measure of what looked like very expensive whiskey. "Can I get you something? You look like you could use it." Grace shook her head, still trying to process everything that had happened. "Are you really Jonathan Blackstone?" He took a long sip of his drink before answering. "Yes and no. I am Jonathan Blackstone, but Jonathan Blackstone is supposed to be dead. 3 years ago, there was a car accident. My car went off a bridge during a storm. They never found the body, which wasn't surprising given the conditions and the current. Everyone assumed I'd drowned. But you didn't." "No, I survived. Barely." He touched his left shoulder absently, and Grace noticed the way his shirt pulled tight across what looked like old scar tissue. "I spent 2 months in a hospital using a fake name, paying cash for everything. When I was well enough to think clearly, I realized something." "What?" Jonathan sat down across from her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. "I realized that I didn't want to go back to being Jonathan Blackstone. The man who died in that accident was miserable. He was surrounded by people who only wanted his money, trapped in business deals with criminals, drowning in a life that felt more like a prison than a privilege." Grace found herself leaning forward, captivated by his story, despite the danger that still hung over them like a storm cloud. "So I stayed dead," he continued. "I let everyone believe Jonathan Blackstone had died, and I came here to figure out who I really was without all the expectations and baggage. But the money Vincent Romano mentioned," Jonathan's expression darkened. "Before my death, I was involved in some questionable business arrangements. The Romano family was supposed to facilitate certain international transactions. When they failed to deliver, I withheld payment. Apparently, they don't believe that death voids business contracts." Grace stared at him, trying to reconcile the man sitting across from her with everything she'd just learned. He was supposed to be dead. He was hiding from dangerous criminals, and he owed more money than she could fathom. By all logic, she should be running as fast as her legs could carry her. Instead, all she could think about was the way he'd stepped between her and Vincent Romano, ready to protect her, even though he barely knew her. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. Jonathan met her eyes, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore slipped away completely. What she saw underneath took her breath away. Loneliness, fear, and a desperate kind of hope that made her heart ache. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 3 years I've been living in this bubble, pretending the outside world didn't exist. But now they've found you. Now they've found me," he agreed. "And worse, they know about you." The weight of that realization settled over Grace like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just an innocent bystander anymore. By being in the wrong place at the wrong time, she'd become part of whatever dangerous game was being played between Jonathan and the Romano family. "I should leave," she said, though the words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth. "I should pack my things and go back to Hartford. Pretend this never happened." Jonathan studied her face intently. "Is that what you want to do?" Grace looked around the study, at the books that suggested a brilliant mind, the music that spoke of a sensitive soul, the warm fire that made this feel more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. Then she looked back at Jonathan, at this man who was supposed to be dead but felt more alive than anyone she'd ever met. "No," she said quietly, "but I should." "Grace." He leaned forward, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the smoky scent of the fireplace. "I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. These people don't make idle threats. If you stay, you're putting yourself at risk. And if I go—" Jonathan's smile was sad and knowing. "If you go, you'll be safe. You'll go back to your life in Hartford, find another job, and none of this will have been real." Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. "What's your real name?" she asked suddenly. The question seemed to surprise him. "What do you mean?" "Jonathan Blackstone is who you were before. Who are you now?" He was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet. For 3 years, I've been hiding from who I was, but I never figured out who I wanted to be." He looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Maybe I need someone to help me figure that out." The invitation in his words was unmistakable, and Grace felt herself standing at a crossroads that would determine the entire course of her life. She could walk away right now, go back to her safe, predictable world of financial struggle and quiet desperation. Or she could stay and help a man find himself while risking everything in the process. The smart choice was obvious. The right choice was something else entirely. "Okay," she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she felt. "I'll stay." Jonathan's eyes widened in surprise. "Grace, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, standing up from her chair. "You're in trouble. You're alone. And you need help. 3 years ago, I would have run. But 3 years ago, I was a different person too." "What changed?" Grace thought about all the jobs she'd lost, all the nights she'd gone to bed hungry, all the times she'd been overlooked and underestimated simply because she didn't have money or connections or the right clothes. She thought about how it felt to be invisible in a world that only valued what you could offer materially. "I learned that sometimes the most worthwhile things in life are the ones that scare you the most," she said. Jonathan stood as well, moving closer until they were only inches apart. Grace could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "I can't promise you'll be safe," he said softly. "I can't promise I won't be terrified," she replied. "I can't offer you the life you deserve." Grace reached up and touched his face gently, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her fingertips. "Maybe what I deserve isn't what I need." For a moment, they stood frozen in that space between decision and action, between the safety of the known and the terrifying possibility of the unknown. Then Jonathan covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his cheek. "What do we do now?" Grace whispered. Jonathan's smile was the first truly genuine one she'd seen from him. "Now? Now we figure out how to save my life. And maybe, if we're very lucky, we'll figure out how to live it too." Outside, the wind howled through the trees surrounding Thornfield Estate, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside the study, with the fire crackling and 2 people discovering they might not be as alone as they thought, the future felt full of dangerous, beautiful possibilities. Grace Patterson had come to this mansion looking for a job. Instead, she'd found a mystery, a threat, and a man who made her believe that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't about what you had to offer. Maybe it was about what you were brave enough to risk. The morning sun streaming through the study windows felt surreal after the events of the previous night. Grace had barely slept, her mind racing between fear of Vincent Romano's threats and the memory of Jonathan's hand covering hers. She'd expected to wake up and discover it had all been some elaborate nightmare, but the reality hit her the moment she saw Jonathan sitting at his desk, surrounded by financial documents, and looking like he hadn't slept at all. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, and Grace noticed the dark circles under his eyes. His hair was disheveled, and his white shirt was wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it, assuming he'd slept at all. "Morning." I've been going through my accounts, trying to figure out if there's any way to come up with the money Romano wants." His voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "The short answer is no, not without liquidating everything, and even then—" Grace moved closer to look at the papers scattered across his desk. Even with her limited understanding of high finance, she could see the problem. Jonathan's wealth was tied up in investments, properties, and assets that couldn't be converted to cash quickly, especially not by someone who was officially dead. "What about selling some of the art?" she suggested, gesturing toward the priceless paintings that adorned the walls. "Or jewelry?" Jonathan shook his head. "Romano doesn't want art or jewelry. He wants cash, and he wants it clean. The kind of money that can disappear into offshore accounts without leaving a trail." The hopelessness in his voice made Grace's chest ache. She found herself reaching out to touch his shoulder, offering what comfort she could. "There has to be another way," she said firmly. "We just need to think." Her words were interrupted by the sharp buzz of her cell phone. Grace glanced at the screen and felt her heart skip a beat. It was her best friend and former roommate, Becca Johnson, calling from Hartford. "I should take this," Grace said apologetically. "She'll worry if I don't answer." Jonathan nodded, turning back to his papers as Grace stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Gracie!" Becca's voice practically exploded through the phone speaker. "Girl, where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for 3 days. I was about to report you missing to the police, the FBI, and that psychic lady from the shopping mall." Despite everything, Grace found herself smiling. Becca had that effect on people. Her infectious energy and dramatic flair could make anyone feel better, even in the worst circumstances. "I'm sorry, Becca. I've been busy with the new job." "Busy?" "Honey, it's housekeeping, not rocket science. How busy can you be dusting some rich guy's mansion?" There was a pause, and Grace could practically hear Becca's mental gears turning. "Unless—" "Oh my God, Grace. Please tell me you're not sleeping with your boss." "I mean, I'm all for improving your financial situation through strategic romance, but you've got to be smarter about these things." "Becca," Grace glanced nervously toward the study, hoping Jonathan couldn't hear her friend's booming voice through the phone. "I'm just saying, if you're gonna bag yourself a millionaire, make sure he's the marrying kind. None of this sugar daddy nonsense. You deserve someone who'll put a ring on it and give you access to the joint checking account." Grace felt heat creep up her neck. "It's not like that. It's complicated." "Oh, honey." Becca's voice dropped to a stage whisper that was somehow even louder than her normal speaking voice. "It's always complicated with rich men. That's part of their charm. But seriously, what's going on? You sound weird." Grace looked back toward the study, where she could see Jonathan still hunched over his desk, the weight of the world on his shoulders. She made a split-second decision that would probably terrify her later. "Becca, I need you to come here, to Connecticut, today." There was a long pause. "Gracie, you're scaring me. Are you in trouble?" "Maybe. I can't explain over the phone, but I need someone I trust. And you're the smartest person I know when it comes to getting out of impossible situations." "Damn right I am," Becca said, and Grace could hear her moving around her apartment, probably already packing. "Text me the address." "I'll catch the next bus. But Grace, if this rich boy has hurt you in any way, I'm bringing my pepper spray and my attitude, and both of them are loaded for bear." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at the fierce loyalty in her friend's voice. "Thank you, Becca. I love you." "Love you too, girl. And don't worry, Aunt Becca's coming to fix whatever mess you've gotten yourself into." After hanging up, Grace returned to the study to find Jonathan watching her with curiosity. "Everything all right?" he asked. "I called my best friend. She's coming here today." Grace saw the alarm that flashed across Jonathan's face and quickly continued. "I trust her completely, and she's resourceful. If anyone can help us figure a way out of this, it's Becca." "Grace, the fewer people who know about this, the better. I know. But Jonathan, we need help. And sometimes the best help comes from the most unexpected places." Before Jonathan could respond, Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her expression more pinched than usual. "Sir, there's a person at the front gate demanding to see Miss Grace. She claims to be her friend, though I must say she's rather—" Mrs. Hartwell paused, searching for the appropriate word. "Colorful." Grace checked her phone and realized 3 hours had passed while she'd been absorbed in Jonathan's financial documents. "That's Becca. She must have caught an earlier bus." "She's been arguing with the security system for 10 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell continued with obvious disapproval. "She called it a pretentious piece of electronic nonsense and threatened to climb the fence if we didn't let her in immediately." Grace couldn't help but laugh. "That sounds like Becca. Can you let her through the gate?" Mrs. Hartwell looked to Jonathan, who nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Though I should warn you, she's also brought what appears to be enough luggage for a month-long stay in a bag from something called Taco Town." 20 minutes later, Grace heard a commotion in the front hall that could only mean one thing. Hurricane Becca had arrived. "Holy Mother of Pearl," came a voice that could probably be heard in the next county. "This place is like something out of Downton Abbey, if the Crawleys had invested in Bitcoin." "Grace, where are you, girl?" Grace hurried to the foyer, with Jonathan following more cautiously behind her. The sight that greeted them was exactly what Grace had expected. Becca Johnson, in all her 5'2", platinum blonde glory, wearing a hot pink tracksuit that clashed magnificently with her neon green sneakers. She was dragging 2 enormous suitcases and clutching a bag of takeout that was filling the dignified foyer with the smell of tacos and hot sauce. "There you are!" Becca dropped everything and launched herself at Grace, nearly knocking her over with an enthusiastic hug. "I brought emergency supplies: tacos, chocolate, wine, and my good push-up bra in case we need to seduce anyone for information." "Becca," Grace said, trying not to laugh at the scandalized expression on Mrs. Hartwell's face, "I'd like you to meet Jonathan Blackstone. Jonathan, this is my best friend Rebecca Johnson." Becca turned to study Jonathan with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Her eyes traveled from his expensive shoes to his designer shirt to his perfectly styled hair, and Grace could practically see her mental calculator working. "Well, well, well," Becca said finally, extending a hand with nails painted in glittery purple polish. "So, you're the mysterious millionaire who's got my girl all twisted up. I gotta say, the photos on Google don't do you justice." Jonathan looked confused. "Photos on Google? Oh, honey," Becca said with a pitying look. "You can't hide from the internet. Though I gotta admit, most of the pictures are from like 3 years ago. You've been living like a hermit or something?" Grace and Jonathan exchanged a meaningful look. Trust Becca to stumble onto the truth within 5 minutes of arrival. "Something like that," Jonathan said carefully. Becca's eyes narrowed slightly. She might come across as a blonde bombshell with more enthusiasm than sense, but Grace knew her friend was sharp as a tack when it mattered. "Uh-huh. And I suppose this mysterious hermit lifestyle is why Grace sounded like she was about to have a nervous breakdown on the phone." The directness of the question seemed to catch Jonathan off guard. He looked at Grace, clearly unsure how much to reveal. "It's okay," Grace said softly. "I told you, I trust her completely." Becca looked back and forth between them, and Grace saw the exact moment when her friend's protective instincts kicked into high gear. Becca might be loud and irreverent, but she had an uncanny ability to read people and situations. "All right, you two," Becca said, setting down her taco bag and putting her hands on her hips. "I didn't take a 3-hour bus ride and miss my stories to play 20 questions. What kind of trouble are we dealing with here? And don't even think about lying to me, because I've got a 6th sense for bullshit that's never been wrong." Grace looked at Jonathan, who sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private," he said, glancing meaningfully at Mrs. Hartwell, who was still hovering nearby with obvious disapproval. "Good idea," Becca said, gathering up her belongings. "But first, is there somewhere I can heat up these tacos? Because I haven't eaten since Hartford, and I do my best thinking on a full stomach." 15 minutes later, they were back in Jonathan's study. Becca had claimed the chair closest to the fire and was working her way through a massive burrito while listening to Jonathan explain the situation. Grace watched her friend's face carefully, noting how Becca's expression grew more serious with each revelation. "So let me get this straight," Becca said when Jonathan finished. "You faked your own death 3 years ago to escape some bad business deals. You've been hiding out here playing dead billionaire, and now the mob wants $60 million? Or they're gonna hurt Grace?" "That's a simplified version, but essentially accurate," Jonathan confirmed. Becca was quiet for a long moment, which was so unusual that Grace began to worry. Finally, her friend leaned back in her chair and grinned. "Well, shit. This is way more interesting than I expected when I woke up this morning." "Becca," Grace said worriedly, "this isn't a game. These people are dangerous." "Oh, honey, I know exactly how dangerous they are. I grew up in Hartford, remember? I've seen what people like Vincent Romano can do." Becca's expression grew serious. "But here's the thing. Bullies like Romano prey on people who are isolated and scared. They count on their victims feeling like they have no options." "What are you suggesting?" Jonathan asked. Becca's grin returned, and Grace recognized the look. It was the same expression her friend had worn when she'd convinced 3 different landlords to let them slide on rent, when she'd talked their way into VIP sections at clubs they couldn't afford, and when she'd somehow managed to get Grace's abusive ex-boyfriend arrested for harassment. "I'm suggesting, Mr. Officially Dead Billionaire, that you've been thinking about this all wrong. You don't need to come up with $60 million. "I don't?" "Nope. You need to make Vincent Romano believe that killing you would cost him a lot more than letting you live." Jonathan and Grace stared at her in confusion. "Think about it," Becca continued, warming to her theme. "Right now, Romano sees you as a guy hiding in a mansion with no options and no allies. He figures he can push you around because what are you gonna do? Call the cops? You're legally dead. Go to the media? Same problem. Fight back? You're one guy against an entire criminal organization." "That's exactly the problem," Jonathan said. "No, that's his assumption, and assumptions can be wrong." Becca stood up and began pacing in front of the fireplace. "What if Vincent Romano discovered that the man he's trying to shake down isn't some helpless hermit? What if he found out that Jonathan Blackstone has allies he doesn't know about? Resources he hasn't considered? Leverage he can't account for?" Grace felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "What kind of leverage?" Becca's smile was positively wicked. "The kind that comes from having friends in low places, connections in high ones, and absolutely no qualms about playing dirty when someone threatens the people we love." She turned to Jonathan, her expression becoming deadly serious. "But I need to know something first. Are you worth saving? Because if I'm going to put my ass on the line for you, I need to know that you're not just another rich asshole who thinks money can solve everything." Jonathan met her stare steadily. "I can't promise I'm worth saving, but I can promise that I'd rather die than let anything happen to Grace because of my past mistakes." Becca studied his face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good answer. All right then, boys and girls, school is in session. Professor Rebecca Johnson is about to teach you everything you need to know about beating bullies at their own game." Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began: genuine hope. Looking at her best friend's determined expression and Jonathan's growing confidence, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. "What's the plan?" Grace asked. Becca's grin was pure mischief. "First, we're going to make Vincent Romano an offer he can't refuse. Then, we're going to make him an offer he can't accept. And somewhere in between, we're going to remind him why it's always a mistake to underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose." Jonathan laughed, and Grace realized it was the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him since they'd met. "I like your friend," he said to Grace. "Yeah," Grace replied, feeling her own smile spread across her face. "She tends to grow on people, like a really stubborn, really loud fungus." "Hey!" Becca protested. "I prefer to think of myself as a delightful tropical plant, exotic, vibrant, and absolutely essential for a healthy ecosystem." For the first time since Vincent Romano had walked through their door, Grace felt like maybe they weren't facing this alone. They had something Romano didn't expect: friendship, loyalty, and a woman from Hartford who had never met a problem she couldn't solve with enough attitude and creative thinking. The game was about to change, and Grace couldn't wait to see the look on Vincent Romano's face when he realized he'd picked a fight with the wrong people. Becca had transformed Jonathan's study into what she cheerfully called mission control. The elegant space now looked like a cross between a war room and a college dorm, with takeout containers, legal pads covered in her distinctive purple ink, and a laptop displaying multiple browser windows that made Grace's head spin just looking at them. "Okay, team," Becca announced, standing in front of the fireplace like a general addressing her troops. She'd changed out of her tracksuit into what she called her serious business outfit, a black blazer over jeans and heels that added 3 inches to her diminutive frame. "Let's review what we know about our friendly neighborhood loan shark." She gestured dramatically toward the laptop screen, which displayed what appeared to be a comprehensive dossier on Vincent Romano. Vincent, Vinny the Shark Romano, age 47, currently residing in a lovely colonial in Westchester that's definitely not purchased with legitimate income. He's got 2 ex-wives, 3 kids who won't speak to him, and a gambling problem that would make a Vegas casino owner weep tears of joy. Jonathan leaned forward, studying the information. "How did you find all this in just 6 hours?" Becca's grin was positively feral. "Honey, you didn't grow up poor without learning how to find information people don't want you to have. Plus, I may have called in a few favors from my cousin Tommy, who works in data recovery. And before you ask, no, you don't want to know what that actually means." Grace felt a mix of admiration and mild terror at her friend's resourcefulness. "Becca, please tell me you didn't do anything illegal." "Define illegal," Becca said with an innocent expression that fooled absolutely no one. "But don't worry. Everything we're going to use is either public record or stuff that Vinny posted on social media himself. You'd be amazed how much criminals love to overshare on Instagram." She clicked to another screen, which showed Romano's social media profiles. Grace was astonished to see photos of expensive cars, jewelry, and what appeared to be a very lavish lifestyle. "See, this is what I'm talking about," Becca continued. "Our boy Vinny has a serious image problem. He wants everyone to think he's this big, scary mobster. But look at this." She pointed to a recent post showing Romano at what appeared to be a charity gala. 3 weeks ago, he was at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, posing with the mayor and half the city council. "I don't understand," Jonathan said. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Becca replied. "See, guys like Romano exist in 2 worlds. In one world, they're respected businessmen who donate to charity and rub shoulders with politicians. In the other world, they threaten people and break kneecaps. The trick is making those 2 worlds collide in a way that's very, very inconvenient for them." Grace began to see where her friend was going with this. "You want to expose him publicly?" "Not expose. That would just make him more dangerous. I want to make him realize that harassing a certain dead billionaire and his lovely housekeeper would bring the kind of attention that could destroy his carefully constructed legitimate business empire." Becca moved to another window on her laptop, revealing what appeared to be a complex web of business connections. Turns out, our friendly loan shark has his fingers in a lot of pies. Construction contracts, waste management, import, export businesses, all technically legal, all requiring him to maintain good relationships with people who very much do not want to be associated with mob violence. Jonathan stood up and began pacing, his legal mind clearly working through the implications. "You're talking about mutually assured destruction." "Exactly. Except instead of nuclear weapons, we're using social embarrassment and bad publicity." Becca looked tremendously pleased with herself. "Romano can threaten us all he wants in private, but if those threats become public knowledge, he loses everything he's worked to build in the legitimate world. But how do we make the threats public without putting ourselves in more danger?" Grace asked. Becca's smile turned mysterious. That, my dear friend, is where Phase 2 of Operation Don't Mess With Us comes into play. She moved to the desk and pulled out a manila folder that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Jonathan, I need you to tell me everything you know about Romano's business dealings. Specifically, the deal that went bad and led to all this. Jonathan's expression grew uncomfortable. I'm not proud of what I was involved in back then. I'm not asking you to be proud of it, Becca said gently. I'm asking you to help us use it to keep Grace safe. Sometimes you have to revisit your mistakes to fix them. Grace reached over and took Jonathan's hand. Whatever it was, we'll deal with it together. Jonathan looked down at their joined hands, then back at Becca's expectant face. Finally, he sighed and began to speak. Romano's family was supposed to facilitate some international financial transfers. Nothing technically illegal, but let's say they were designed to minimize tax obligations for some very wealthy clients. Offshore accounts? Becca asked. Among other things. The Romano organization had connections in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and several other places that don't ask too many questions about where money comes from. Jonathan's voice was heavy with regret. I was young, stupid, and thought I was smarter than everyone else. When the transfers failed to happen as promised, I withheld payment. A lot of payment. How much exactly? Grace asked quietly. 50 million, as Romano mentioned. But that was just the fee for their services. The actual money being transferred was... Jonathan paused, seeming to steel himself. Nearly $500 million. Grace felt her breath catch. $500 million. The number was so large it didn't even seem real. Becca, however, looked like she'd just been given the best Christmas present of her life. Oh, this is perfect, she said, clapping her hands together. This is absolutely perfect. How is this perfect? Grace demanded. This makes everything worse. No, sweetie, this makes everything better. Because now we know something Vincent Romano definitely doesn't want anyone else to find out. Becca turned to Jonathan. Tell me, when these transfers failed to happen, where did all that money end up? Jonathan's expression grew even more uncomfortable. That's complicated. Uncomplicated. The money belonged to several very powerful people. Politicians, CEOs, foreign nationals who were trying to avoid certain international sanctions. When the transfers failed, they lost everything. Some of them ended up in prison. Others lost their companies. A few... Jonathan swallowed hard. A few ended up dead. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. So you're telling me, Becca said slowly, that Vincent Romano was part of a scheme that not only cost some very dangerous people $500 million, but also led to their imprisonment and possible death? Yes. And these very dangerous people probably don't know that Romano was the one who screwed up the transfers? They know someone in his organization was responsible, but Romano managed to shift the blame to some of his subordinates. Several of whom are now serving life sentences for crimes they didn't commit. Becca's smile was now positively radiant. Jonathan Blackstone, you beautiful, complicated man, you have just given us the keys to the kingdom. I don't understand, Grace said. Simple, honey. Vincent Romano isn't just a loan shark trying to collect money from a dead man. He's a guy who screwed over some of the most dangerous people in the world and then let innocent people take the fall for his mistakes. If those powerful, dangerous people found out the truth about what really happened to their money, Romano would be a dead man, Jonathan finished, understanding dawning in his eyes. Exactly. And all we have to do is make him believe that information might become public if anything happens to either of you. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Becca, we can't actually expose that information. Innocent people would get hurt. We don't have to actually expose it, sweetie. We just have to make Romano think we might. It's called leverage, and it's about time we had some. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the ethical implications of what Becca was suggesting. There's something else, he said finally. The reason I withheld payment from Romano wasn't just because the transfers failed. It was because I discovered that some of the money being moved belonged to human trafficking operations. I couldn't be part of that. Grace felt her heart swell with relief and pride. Even in his darkest moment, Jonathan had tried to do the right thing. Becca's expression grew serious. That actually makes this easier. We're not protecting a criminal. We're protecting someone who tried to stop criminals. She moved back to her laptop and began typing rapidly. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to arrange a meeting with Vincent Romano. A very public meeting, in a very respectable location, with lots of witnesses. That sounds dangerous, Grace said. It would be if we were planning to threaten him, but we're not. We're going to make him a business proposition. What kind of business proposition? Becca's grin was pure mischief. The kind where everybody wins, but some people win a lot more than others. She pulled up another document on her laptop, what appeared to be a legal contract. Jonathan, you're going to offer to pay Vincent Romano his money, all of it, plus interest. But I don't have that kind of cash available. No, but you have something better. You have information that could save Romano's life if the wrong people come looking for him. And you have the ability to make certain financial records disappear forever. Grace began to see the brilliance of Becca's plan. You want to turn this from extortion into a legitimate business transaction. Exactly. Romano gets his money, but instead of just taking it and running, he enters into a long-term business relationship with the very much alive Jonathan Blackstone. A relationship that benefits both of them and ensures Romano has every reason to keep Jonathan's resurrection a secret. Jonathan stared at the contract in amazement. You want me to hire Vincent Romano? I want you to make Vincent Romano your business partner. Give him a reason to protect you instead of destroy you. Make him more money by keeping you alive than he could ever make by killing you. And if he refuses? Becca's expression grew cold. Then we remind him that there are people out there who lost $500 million and several years of their lives because of his incompetence. People who might be very interested to learn the truth about what really happened. Grace felt a surge of admiration for her friend's strategic thinking, mixed with terror at the risks they were taking. This could work, Jonathan said slowly. It's insane, but it could actually work. Of course it could work. I thought of it. Becca snapped her laptop shut with satisfaction. Now, we need to make some phone calls, arrange a meeting, and prepare for the performance of our lives. Performance? Grace asked. Honey, we're about to convince a dangerous criminal that his best option is to become business partners with a dead man and his housekeeper. If that's not performance art, I don't know what is. As if on cue, Jonathan's phone rang. All three of them stared at it for a moment before Jonathan answered. Vincent, he said calmly. I was just about to call you. Grace could hear Romano's voice through the phone, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever he was saying made Jonathan's jaw tighten. That's an interesting proposal, Vincent, but I have a better one. Meet me tomorrow at the Meridian Club in Manhattan, 2 o'clock. We'll discuss this like civilized businessmen. There was more talking from Romano's end, his voice getting louder and more agitated. Vincent, Jonathan said, his voice taking on a tone of authority Grace had never heard before. I'm offering you the chance to walk away from this situation wealthier and more powerful than you've ever been. Or you can continue with your current approach and discover exactly why some people are better left alone, even when they're dead. The line went quiet. 2 o'clock, Vincent. Don't be late. Jonathan hung up and looked at Becca with newfound respect. I think I'm beginning to understand why Grace trusts you so completely. Just wait until you see me in action tomorrow, Becca replied. Vincent Romano thinks he's dealing with some scared hermit and his helpless housekeeper. He's about to learn that he's actually picked a fight with a dead billionaire, a woman who's got nothing left to lose, and a girl from Hartford who's never met a bully she couldn't take down. Grace felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with terror. Tomorrow, they would either solve their problem permanently or make it infinitely worse. But looking at Jonathan's determined expression and Becca's confident smile, she found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, They were about to turn the tables on Vincent Romano in a way he would never see coming. The game was definitely changing, and Grace couldn't wait to see who would be left standing when the dust settled. The Meridian Club in Manhattan was exactly the kind of place where billionaires went to make deals that changed the world. Its marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of long-dead industrialists created an atmosphere of old money and older power. Grace felt completely out of place in her borrowed designer dress, another gift from Becca's mysteriously extensive wardrobe, but she forced herself to walk with confidence as they approached the private dining room Jonathan had reserved. "Remember," Becca whispered, adjusting Grace's pearl necklace one final time, "you're not Grace Patterson, struggling housekeeper. Today, you're Grace Patterson, trusted advisor to one of the most powerful men in America. Own it." Jonathan, resplendent in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Grace's annual salary, squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to say anything during the meeting. Just being here shows Romano that I'm not the isolated hermit he thinks I am." "What if something goes wrong?" Grace asked, her stomach churning with nervous energy. "Then we improvise," Becca said cheerfully. She looked stunning in a navy blue power suit that managed to be both professional and subtly threatening. "But trust me, honey. I've been planning this for 18 hours straight. Vincent Romano is about to get the surprise of his life." They entered the private dining room to find Vincent Romano already seated at the mahogany table, flanked by two men who were clearly bodyguards despite their expensive suits. Romano himself looked different than he had at the mansion, cleaner, more polished, playing the part of the legitimate businessman. But his eyes held the same cold calculation Grace remembered from that terrifying night. "Well, well," Romano said, standing as they approached. "The dead man rises, and he brings friends." "Vincent," Jonathan replied smoothly, extending his hand in a gesture that somehow managed to be both cordial and commanding. "Thank you for meeting me here. I believe you know Miss Patterson, my personal assistant, and this is Rebecca Johnson, my legal consultant." Grace noticed how Jonathan had subtly redefined their roles. She was no longer a housekeeper who'd overheard something she shouldn't have. She was his personal assistant, implying trust and authority. Becca wasn't just Grace's friend. She was a legal consultant, suggesting expertise and connections. Romano's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in these new dynamics, but he shook hands with each of them. "Legal consultant? That's interesting. I wasn't aware you were planning to make this a legal matter, Johnny." "Everything I do is a legal matter now, Vincent. I've found that legitimacy is far more profitable than the alternative." Jonathan gestured for everyone to sit. "Shall we order lunch? I find that business discussions go much more smoothly over good food." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as polite conversation. Jonathan ordered wine that cost more per bottle than most people made in a month, discussing the vintages with the sommelier as if money was no object. Becca casually mentioned several high-profile legal cases she'd supposedly worked on, dropping names that made even Romano's bodyguards look impressed. Grace said little, but she made notes in a leather portfolio, playing the part of the efficient assistant recording her boss's every word. All the while, Vincent Romano grew visibly more uncomfortable. This wasn't the meeting he'd expected. Instead of a desperate man begging for his life, he was facing a confident businessman who acted like he held all the cards. Finally, after the main course had been served and cleared, Jonathan leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Now then, Vincent, let's discuss why we're really here. I think you know why we're here, Johnny. You owe my family $60 million, and we want it, now." "Actually," Becca interjected smoothly, "that's not quite accurate. According to the original contract, which I've reviewed extensively, Mr. Blackstone owes your organization $50 million for services that were never satisfactorily completed. The additional $10 million you mentioned appears to be arbitrary interest that has no legal basis." Romano's face flushed red. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are. I'm someone who spent the last 18 hours reviewing financial records, communication logs, and federal investigation reports related to the Cayman Islands incident of 3 years ago, Becca replied calmly. Would you like me to continue? The room went dead silent. Grace watched Romano's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally something that looked very much like fear. I don't know what you think you know, Romano said carefully. We know everything, Vincent, Jonathan said quietly. We know about the $500 million in assets that disappeared. We know about the people who went to prison. We know about the people who died. And we know exactly who was responsible for the security failures that led to it all. Romano's bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, their hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons. But Becca held up a finger. Gentlemen, I wouldn't recommend any aggressive actions. We're in one of the most exclusive clubs in Manhattan, surrounded by witnesses and under complete surveillance. More importantly, if anything happens to any of us, certain information will be automatically released to some very interested parties. You're bluffing, Romano said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Becca pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. Funny thing about the digital age, Vincent. Information wants to be free. All it takes is one delayed email, one scheduled social media post, one automated document release. She let the implications hang in the air. Grace watched Romano's face and saw the exact moment when he realized he was no longer in control of the situation. What do you want? He asked finally. I want to offer you a job, Jonathan said. Romano blinked in surprise. A what? A job. A legitimate, profitable, long-term business arrangement that will make all of us wealthy and keep certain unfortunate truths buried forever. Jonathan nodded to Grace, who opened her portfolio and slid a contract across the table. This is a consulting agreement, Jonathan explained. My organization needs someone with your particular skills and connections to handle certain delicate international transactions. Completely legal, I assure you, but requiring discretion and expertise that's difficult to find in traditional banking circles. Romano stared at the contract as if it might bite him. You want to hire me after I threatened to kill you? Vincent, you didn't threaten to kill me. You made a business proposition under less than ideal circumstances. I'm simply making a counteroffer. Jonathan's smile was perfectly pleasant and absolutely terrifying at the same time. Think of it as a merger. Your connections and my resources, working together instead of against each other. And if I refuse? Becca leaned forward slightly. Then you refuse. You walk away from this table, and we never speak again. Of course, we can't control what happens to certain information once you're no longer under our protection. Protection? Oh yes, Jonathan said casually. You see, Vincent, as my business partner, you'd be under my umbrella. Anyone who wanted to hurt you would have to go through me first. And I assure you, I have resources that most people can't even imagine. Grace watched Romano's face as he processed this. The man was clearly torn between rage at being outmaneuvered and genuine fear of the consequences if he refused. How much? Romano asked finally. $5 million a year, plus bonuses based on successful completion of projects, Jonathan replied smoothly. All completely legitimate income that you can report to the IRS with pride. $5 million? One of Romano's bodyguards whistled softly despite himself. Plus, Becca added, Mr. Blackstone would be happy to help you restructure some of your existing business interests to ensure they're in full compliance with federal regulations. Think of it as a fresh start. Romano was quiet for a long moment, clearly doing calculations in his head. Grace held her breath, knowing that everything depended on his next words. I'd want guarantees, Romano said finally. Written guarantees that certain information stays buried. Of course, Jonathan agreed. As long as our business relationship remains satisfactory. I see no reason why anyone else needs to know about past indiscretions. And the original debt? Consider it forgiven as a signing bonus. After all, partners don't collect debts from each other. They share profits. Romano looked at the contract again, then at his bodyguards, then back at Jonathan. Grace could practically see the mental calculations happening behind his eyes. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course you do," Becca said cheerfully. "Take all the time you need. Say, 48 hours. After that, we'll need to explore other options for handling our mutual concerns." The threat was delivered with such sweetness that it took a moment for its implications to sink in. Romano's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. 48 hours, he agreed. He stood, his bodyguards rising with him. "This has been educational." "I'm so glad you think so," Jonathan replied, standing as well. "I look forward to working with you, Vincent. I think you'll find that legitimacy is far more profitable than you might expect." After Romano and his men left, the three of them sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "Did that actually work?" Grace asked finally. "I think it did," Jonathan replied, sounding slightly amazed. "He's going to take the deal." "Of course he is," Becca said, draining her wineglass. "He's not stupid. We just offered him more money than he's ever made legally, protection from some very dangerous people, and a way out of a life that was eventually going to get him killed." "But what if he doesn't?" Grace pressed. "What if he decides to call our bluff?" Becca and Jonathan exchanged a look that made Grace's stomach flutter with unease. "Then," Jonathan said quietly, "we weren't bluffing." The implications of that statement hung in the air as they gathered their things and prepared to leave. Grace realized that somewhere between the mansion and this moment, she'd gone from innocent bystander to active participant in a game far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But as they walked out of the Meridian Club together, she also realized something else. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. Not because of money or connections, but because she was part of something bigger than herself. She was part of a team that had just faced down a dangerous criminal and won. "So what happens now?" she asked as they waited for their car. "Now," Jonathan said, taking her hand, "we go home and wait to see if Vincent Romano is as smart as we think he is." "And if he is?" Jonathan's smile was warm and genuine, nothing like the calculated charm he displayed during the meeting. "If he is, then we've just solved our biggest problem and gained a very useful ally. And if he isn't?" Becca grinned and patted the briefcase she'd been carrying throughout the meeting. "Then we implement Plan B, and trust me, Vincent Romano really doesn't want to find out what Plan B looks like." As their car pulled up, Grace found herself laughing despite everything they'd been through. 2 weeks ago, her biggest worry had been making rent. Now she was part of a conspiracy that had just turned a mob enforcer into a business partner. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and absolutely insane. It was also, she realized as Jonathan helped her into the car, exactly where she wanted to be. The drive back to Thornfield Estate was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just accomplished. But Grace found herself stealing glances at Jonathan, seeing him with new eyes. This wasn't the broken, hiding man she'd first encountered. This was someone who had just reclaimed his power and his place in the world. And somehow, incredibly, he'd chosen to share that journey with her. As they pulled through the gates of the estate, Grace realized that whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. She'd tasted power, faced down danger, and discovered that she was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. But most importantly, she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. A place where she belonged, and people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could offer. The game was far from over, but for the first time, Grace felt like they were winning. 47 hours and 36 minutes. Grace had been counting. She sat in the estate's library, pretending to read a leather-bound copy of Pride and Prejudice while actually watching Jonathan pace back and forth in front of the massive windows overlooking the gardens. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Persian rug, and every few minutes one of them would glance at their phone, checking for the call that would determine their fate. Becca had positioned herself at Jonathan's desk, laptop open, looking for all the world like she was casually browsing social media. But Grace knew better. Her friend had contingency plans mapped out for every possible scenario, including several that Grace preferred not to think about too deeply. "He's going to call," Grace said for the dozenth time, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Jonathan or herself. "I know," Jonathan replied, but his continued pacing suggested otherwise. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made all three of them freeze. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her expression more disapproving than usual. "Sir, there's a Mr. Romano here to see you. He's brought associates." Grace felt her heart sink. Associates meant bodyguards, which probably meant Romano had decided to reject their offer in the most violent way possible. "How many associates?" Jonathan asked calmly. "Two, sir. The same gentleman as before." Mrs. Hartwell paused. "Though I must say, they seem rather subdued today." "Show them to the study," Jonathan said. "We'll be right there." After Mrs. Hartwell left, Becca closed her laptop with a decisive snap. "Well, kids, this is it. Either we're about to celebrate the most successful negotiation in criminal history, or we're about to find out if my Plan B is as brilliant as I think it is." "What exactly is Plan B?" Grace asked, realizing she'd never gotten a straight answer to that question. Becca's smile was mysterious. "Trust me, honey. You don't want to know unless we need it." They made their way to the study, where Vincent Romano was waiting with his two bodyguards. But something was different this time. Romano's posture was less aggressive, more resigned. His bodyguard stood at attention but seemed oddly relaxed. "Vincent," Jonathan said smoothly. "Right on time. I appreciate punctuality in business partners." Romano's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Business partners?" "Yeah, about that." He reached into his jacket, causing one of his own bodyguards to tense slightly, and pulled out a folded document. "I had my lawyers look over your contract." Grace held her breath. "They said it was the most generous offer they'd ever seen," Romano continued. "Almost too generous. Made them suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" Becca asked innocently. "Suspicious that maybe I was missing something. So I did some digging of my own." Romano's eyes met Jonathan's. "Turns out you weren't bluffing about those connections of yours." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "I rarely bluff, Vincent." "No, I'm starting to figure that out." Romano unfolded the document. 3 separate federal agencies have had me under investigation for the past 18 months. Did you know that? I may have heard something to that effect. And somehow, mysteriously, all 3 investigations were quietly closed yesterday afternoon. No charges filed, no further action required. Romano's voice was carefully neutral. "That's quite a coincidence." Grace looked at Jonathan in amazement. How had he managed that? "I believe in the power of legitimate business relationships," Jonathan replied. "When people operate within the law, they rarely have problems with federal investigations." Romano laughed, and for the first time since Grace had met him, it sounded genuinely amused rather than threatening. "You son of a bitch. You really are as connected as you pretended to be." "More so, actually. I was being modest." "Modest?" Romano shook his head. "And here I thought I was dealing with some rich hermit who got lucky." Becca leaned forward slightly. "So what's your decision, Vincent?" Romano looked at the contract one more time, then at each of them in turn. When his eyes met Grace's, she was surprised to see something that looked almost like respect. "My decision," he said slowly, "is that I'm tired of looking over my shoulder every day, wondering when my past is going to catch up with me. I'm tired of doing business with people who solve problems with violence, and I'm really tired of being poor compared to the people I work for." He signed the contract with a flourish. "Welcome to the legitimate business world, Vincent," Jonathan said, extending his hand. "I think you're going to like it here." As they shook hands, Grace felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. They'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd turned their greatest enemy into an ally. "So what happens now?" Romano asked. "Now," Becca said, pulling out another folder. We discuss your first assignment. There's a construction company in Newark that's been having problems with their waste management contracts. They need someone with your particular expertise to help them navigate some complex regulatory issues. Regulatory issues? The kind that pay $2 million for successful resolution, Jonathan added. Romano's eyebrows shot up. $2 million? For one job? Vincent, Jonathan said with a smile, you're about to discover that legitimate business is far more profitable than crime. It just requires different skills. Over the next hour, they outlined Romano's new role in Jonathan's organization. Grace watched in fascination as the dynamic between the two men shifted from adversarial to genuinely collaborative. Romano, it turned out, had a sharp business mind beneath his thuggish exterior, and Jonathan seemed to genuinely respect his insights. There's one more thing, Jonathan said, as Romano prepared to leave. The nature of our business requires absolute discretion. My resurrection, so to speak, needs to remain confidential for the foreseeable future. What about the outside world? People are going to wonder where Vincent Romano gets all this new legitimate income. Simple, Becca interjected. You've been hired as a consultant by Blackstone Enterprises. As far as anyone knows, you're working for a private investment firm. Which, technically, you are. Romano nodded slowly. And if anyone from my old life comes asking questions, they won't, Jonathan said with quiet certainty. People who might cause problems for you have been discouraged from doing so. The implication hung in the air. Grace realized that while she'd been worried about Romano's answer, Jonathan had been taking steps to ensure their safety, regardless of what he decided. After Romano and his men left, the three of them stood in the study, hardly believing what they'd accomplished. I can't believe that actually worked, Grace said finally. I can, Becca replied smugly. I told you, bullies are always cowards at heart. Give them a better option, and they'll take it every time. Jonathan moved to the window, looking out over the estate grounds. It's strange, he said quietly. For 3 years, I've been hiding from the world, convinced that Jonathan Blackstone was too damaged to ever come back. But maybe I was wrong. Grace joined him at the window. Maybe Jonathan Blackstone needed to die so that the man he was meant to be could live. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft with emotion. And what kind of man is that? The kind who protects people he cares about. The kind who turns enemies into allies. The kind who builds something better instead of just tearing things down. The kind who falls in love with his housekeeper? He asked softly. Grace felt her breath catch. Is that what's happening here? I think it happened weeks ago, Jonathan admitted. I just wasn't ready to admit it to myself. And now? Now I'm ready to admit a lot of things. He took her hands in his. I'm ready to admit that you're the bravest person I've ever met. That you see me for who I really am, not who I pretend to be. That somewhere along the way, you stopped being my employee and became the most important person in my world. Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Jonathan, I know I can't offer you a normal life. I know there will always be complications, dangers, secrets that need keeping. But I can offer you honesty, loyalty, and love that's deeper than anything I've ever felt before. You don't have to offer me anything, Grace said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. You already gave me everything I never knew I wanted. Which is a place where I belong, people who value me for who I am, the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. She smiled through her tears. The chance to fall in love with a man who thinks I'm worth protecting. Jonathan's kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. But as Grace responded, pouring 3 weeks of growing attraction and deepening emotion into the moment, it became something more, a promise, a declaration, a beginning. Oh, for crying out loud, Becca's voice broke through their moment. Finally, I was starting to think I'd have to lock you two in a closet together. They broke apart, laughing, to find Becca watching them with fond exasperation. "How long have you been standing there?" Grace asked, blushing. "Long enough to know that you two are perfect for each other, and that I definitely deserve credit for making this happen." Becca grinned. "Also long enough to know that we need to have a serious conversation about my consulting fee, saving your lives, turning your enemy into an ally, and playing matchmaker. That's at least worth a substantial bonus." Jonathan laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Name your price, Rebecca Johnson. After what you've accomplished, I'd say you've earned whatever you want." "What I want," Becca said, her expression growing serious, "is for my best friend to be happy. Really, truly happy. For the first time in her life." She looked at Grace, then at Jonathan, then back at Grace. "And I want a job." "A job?" Grace asked in surprise. "Honey, do you think I'm going back to Hartford after all this excitement? I just helped orchestrate the most brilliant con in criminal history. I turned a mob enforcer into a legitimate businessman. I basically saved 3 lives and created a criminal justice miracle." Becca's grin was back in full force. "There's no way I'm going back to my old life after getting a taste of this one." "What kind of job did you have in mind?" Jonathan asked, clearly amused. "Chief Operating Officer, Blackstone Enterprises. Someone's got to keep you two focused on business while you're making googly eyes at each other." Jonathan considered this for a moment. "The position comes with a 7-figure salary, comprehensive benefits, and a company car. Make it a Tesla, and you've got a deal. Done." They shook hands solemnly, then all 3 of them burst into laughter. "So what happens now?" Grace asked, looking around the study that had become the center of their strange, wonderful new world. "Now," Jonathan said, pulling her close, "we build a life together. A real life, with honesty and openness, and all the things I never thought I could have." "What about being legally dead?" "I think it's time for Jonathan Blackstone to make a miraculous recovery," he said with a smile. "I have some very good lawyers who specialize in complex identity issues. Give them a few months, and I'll be legally alive and officially in love with the most amazing woman in the world. And until then, we have this place, we have each other, and we have the best chief operating officer a criminal turned legitimate businessman could ask for." Becca raised an imaginary glass. "To new beginnings, unexpected partnerships, and the power of really good friends in high and low places. To love that's worth fighting for," Jonathan added, looking at Grace. "To finding out that sometimes the best things in life are the ones that scare you the most," Grace finished. As the sun set over Thornfield Estate, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. She'd come here desperate for a job, any job, willing to take whatever she could get just to survive. Instead, she'd found love, purpose, and a family of choice that would stand by her through anything. She'd discovered strength she never knew she had, and courage she never thought she'd need. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can offer someone isn't money or connections or material possessions. Sometimes it's simply the willingness to stay, to fight, to believe in someone when they can't believe in themselves. Vincent Romano had been wrong about one thing. Grace Patterson had everything to offer. She just hadn't known it yet. But Jonathan Blackstone, a man who had learned to value authenticity over appearances and loyalty over wealth, had seen it from the very beginning. And together, with Becca's strategic brilliance and fierce friendship, they'd built something that none of them could have achieved alone, a love story that was worth every risk they'd taken to protect it. 6 months later, when the New York Times ran a story about the miraculous survival and business comeback of presumed dead billionaire Jonathan Blackstone, the article mentioned his recent engagement to Grace Patterson, a woman who had brought stability and purpose to his remarkable second act. What it didn't mention was that Grace Patterson had also brought something far more valuable, the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire worlds. And in the end, that made all the difference.